You are encroaching 3 feet onto common area, and the fines accrue daily until you move your fence. That was the first sentence Brenda Coyle ever said to me, standing at the end of my gravel drive in a coral blazer and white tennis shoes, holding a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She was the president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, 11 years in that chair. And she had come to tell a retired land surveyor that his fence was in the wrong place. The strip she was pointing at was 3 feet of dry grass between my split rail and the gravel easement, and it had belonged to my parcel since the development was platted in 1974. My wife, Diane, is buried under a young maple 30 feet from where Brenda stood. The land was the last thing Diane and I bought together, and it carried her name on the deed before it carried mine alone. What Brenda did not know was that I spent 31 years as a licensed land surveyor in this county, that I had walked nearly every boundary in Cedar Hollow at one time or another, and that I kept a certified copy of the original recorded plat in a labeled folder in my filing cabinet, the same plat the county had on microfilm, the same plat that showed my lot line exactly where my fence stood. She thought she was correcting a confused old man. She was about to spend 2 years arguing against a document she never once bothered to pull. So I want to ask you something before I tell you the rest. If a person in authority told you that you owed money for a mistake you knew was theirs, and you had the proof folded in a drawer, would you wave it in their face on day one? Or would you let them keep building their case until the only thing left to do was read the record out loud? Sit with that. I made my choice, and I will tell you how it went. My name is Hank Mercer. I am 63 years old. I worked for the county survey office for 19 years, and then for myself for another 12. Running boundaries, staking corners, drawing plats, and testifying in the occasional property dispute when 2 neighbors could not agree on where a line fell. A surveyor learns early that the ground does not lie, and people do, not always on purpose. But a man will swear his fence has been in the same spot for 40 years when the pins say it moved 8 feet when he replaced it. So you stop trusting memory, and you start trusting monuments, the iron pins and brass caps and stone corners that somebody set on purpose and recorded on a map. That habit is the whole of my trade, and it is the reason I keep paper the way other men keep tools, oiled and labeled, and where I can find it in the dark. I bought the lot in Cedar Hollow in 1989, 2 acres on the eastern edge of the subdivision, where the platted lots ran big and the common area was nothing but a drainage swale and a gravel maintenance road. I remember the day Diane and I drove out to look at it. The realtor had given up on us by then, because I had walked off 3 other lots after finding the corners did not match the listing, and Diane had started to think I would never be satisfied. This one, though, I walked, and the pins were where the plat said they were, all 4 of them. And I stood at the southwest corner with my boot on a brass cap and told her the land was honest. She laughed at me for saying it that way. Then she walked to the back of the lot, where the maple saplings were coming up wild along the old fence line, and she said, "This is the one," and that was the end of looking. We built the house ourselves over 3 summers, her on the framing and me on the layout, both of us learning as we went. She kept a level in her back pocket the way I kept a pencil behind my ear. She died 4 years ago, in the spring, after a long illness I will not lay out here, except to say that she made me promise the land would stay in the family and stay clean. No liens, no quarrels, nothing for Tess to untangle. I planted a maple over her because the old ones along the back had grown tall, and she had always loved the way they turned in October. That maple is 40 feet from the southwest corner. I mention the distance because it will matter later, and because a surveyor measures everything, even grief. I live there now with my daughter Tess, who is 16, who has her mother's stubbornness and her mother's habit of writing things down. Tess keeps a notebook of everything, has since she was 9. And when this all started, she was the one who said, "Dad, you should photograph the stakes before she pulls them." I did. I want you to remember that, because it mattered. The fence Brenda objected to had stood in the same line since 1990. I set the corners myself, the year after we bought the lot, with a transit and a steel tape and the recorded Plat spread across the hood of my truck. I remember it was a hot Saturday, and Diane brought me iced tea and held the dumb end of the tape while I shot the angles. The southwest corner sat on an iron pin the original surveyor had driven in 1974, a half-inch rebar with a brass cap stamped with his license number, and I had photographed that pin every few years out of professional habit, the way some men photograph their kids on the first day of school. I had a photograph of that pin from 1991, from 1998, from 2006, from 2014. Each one dated, each one showing the same brass cap in the same dirt, with the grass grown a little different around it. The split rail ran from that pin north along the platted line to the second pin at the corner of the gravel easement. I dug every post hole by hand. Diane set the rails. The fence was not just a boundary. It was a thing we built with our hands on a line that a man we never met had surveyed honestly 15 years before we arrived. 3 feet of grass lay between my rail and the gravel because the easement was platted wider than the road that was ever built on it. That is common. A developer dedicates a 60-foot easement, builds a 20-foot gravel road down the middle, and leaves a margin on each side for ditches and snow and future widening that never comes. That 3-foot margin on my side was inside my lot. It was on the Plat. It had always been on the Plat. A man could stand at the brass cap with the recorded Plat in his hand and a tape in the other and prove it in 10 minutes. For 2 years, nobody from the association ever did. Brenda's complaint was that the common area, as shown on a map the HOA had commissioned in 2019, extended 3 feet past my fence, and that my rail was therefore standing on association land. The 2019 map was drawn by a firm out of the city called Apex Geospatial that had never set foot on the iron pins. They had scaled the boundaries off an aerial photograph and a tax parcel layer, which is a fast and cheap way to make a pretty map and a terrible way to locate a property line. The tax parcel layer is a tool for billing, not for boundaries. It is drawn to look right from 1,000 feet up, and it is wrong on the ground by a few feet almost everywhere, because nobody ever intended it to be a survey. I knew the moment I saw it that it was wrong by about 3 feet all along the eastern tier of lots, because whoever drew it had snapped the line to the edge of the gravel instead of the platted easement width. It was a common mistake. I had seen it 100 times. It was also entirely the HOA's mistake, and they wanted me to pay for it. The first notice came in July. A single fine, $50, for an unapproved encroachment. I read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and started a folder. I labeled the folder Cedar Hollow Boundary and wrote the date on the tab. Tess asked what it was. I told her it was the start of something that might take a while, and that the most important thing was to keep every piece of paper and write down every conversation with the date and the time. She nodded like that was the most obvious thing in the world. She is her mother's daughter. I did not call Brenda. I did not storm the next board meeting. I wrote a short letter, polite and plain, stating that my fence sat on the recorded platted line, that the iron pins were in place and photographed, and that I would be happy to walk the line with anyone who wanted to verify it. I enclosed nothing. I had learned long ago that you do not hand a careless adversary your best evidence early, because they will only learn to argue around it. I let the letter be a door I held open. Brenda did not walk through it. What came back was a second notice. The fine had doubled and a new line had been added, accruing daily at $25 until compliance. That was August. I noted the date, the amount, and the language, and I filed the notice behind the first. The tally in my folder read, 2 notices, $100 assessed, plus a daily accrual I did not intend to pay because I did not owe it. I should tell you about the gravel road, because the gravel road is the whole story underneath the story. Cedar Hollow's eastern edge had always been quiet. The lots were big, the common area was a swale, and nobody thought much about the strip of county-zoned ground just past the subdivision line. The year before Brenda's first notice, though, a development company called Hollow Ridge Partners had begun buying options on the farmland east of us. The old Peterson quarter section that had grown nothing but soybeans and deer for as long as I had lived there. I did not know that yet. I knew only that a man in a pressed shirt had knocked on my door in the spring, asking whether I would consider selling. He had a nice handshake and a nicer truck, and he stood on my porch and told me the area was changing, and that a man my age might want to think about cashing out while the cashing was good. I told him the land had my wife's name on it and was not for sale at any number. He nodded like he had expected that. And then he did the thing I have turned over in my mind 100 times since. He looked past me down the side yard to my fence line and the gravel easement, and he looked at it a beat too long, the way a man looks at a thing he is measuring in his head. Then he thanked me and left. I did not think much of it then. A surveyor notices where people look, but I had no reason yet to know what he was looking at. The man was Doug Coyle, Brenda's husband. I would not learn the connection for months, not until a clerk at the county building mentioned offhand that the Hollow Ridge grading application listed a Douglas Coyle as managing partner, and the name caught on something in my memory. And I went home and checked the HOA roster, and there it was. Coyle, Brenda, president. Coyle, Douglas, same address. I will tell you now, though, so you understand what the 3 feet were really about. Hollow Ridge needed a wider access corridor to bring heavy equipment to the farmland they were assembling, and the cheapest corridor ran along the gravel easement on the eastern tier, right past my lot. 3 feet times the length of 6 lots is a road shoulder. It is a turning radius for a cement truck. It is the difference between a permit that fits and a redesign that costs 6 figures. Brenda was not chasing aesthetic harmony. She was clearing a path for her husband's project, 3 feet at a time, 1 fine at a time, hoping the old man on the corner would move his fence, then never ask why. The third escalation came in September, and it came with a costume. Brenda arrived on a Tuesday at 10 in the morning with a man she introduced as a compliance inspector. He wore a yellow safety vest, fresh out of the package, the creases still in it, and he carried a wheel measure, the kind you push along the ground that clicks off feet. He had a lanyard around his neck with a laminated card I was not allowed to read closely. He made a great show of rolling the wheel from the edge of the gravel to my fence and announcing 3 feet 2 inches in the voice of a man reading a verdict. Brenda wrote it down with enormous satisfaction, the pen moving like she was signing a check to herself. I came down off the porch and stood with my hands in my pockets, which is what I do when I want my hands somewhere I can account for them. I asked the man what firm he was with. He said he was a consultant. I asked him whether he was a licensed land surveyor in this state. He glanced at Brenda before he answered, which told me everything. And then he said he did boundary compliance work. That is not a license. That is a phrase. I asked him whether he knew where the iron pins were. He said, "What pins?" I told him there were 2 recorded survey monuments on this line, both set in 1974, both with brass caps, and that any measurement that did not start from a monument was not a boundary measurement. It was a guess with a wheel. He did not have an answer for that. Brenda did. She said the wheel measure was perfectly adequate for the association's purposes. I thanked them both for their time, the way you thank a man who has just shown you his whole hand without meaning to. And I went inside and wrote down the date, the time, the wheel measure reading, the man's refusal to name a license, and the fact that a man with no license had just measured my property from the wrong starting point and called it official. That was the day Tess started photographing the stakes. Brenda had flagged a line in the grass with little orange whiskers, pin flags pushed into the dirt 3 feet inside my fence, marking where she said the common area began. Tess went out that evening with my old camera, the one with the date stamp burned into the corner of every frame, and photographed each flag against the fence and the brass-capped pin. 12 flags. She shot them one at a time, close and then wide, the way I had taught her without really teaching her, just by her watching me do it on jobs. Then she pulled one flag, just one, the one nearest the southwest corner, and we ran the steel tape from the brass cap to the little hole the flag had left. 3 feet and an inch. The flags were planted off the gravel, not off the pin, exactly as I had expected. We pushed the flag back in so Brenda would not know we had checked, tamped the dirt with a boot heel, and walked back to the house in the dark. I filed the photographs in the folder behind the September notice. The tally read 3 incidents, a fake inspector, 12 flags, and a flagged line that began 3 feet from the truth. I want to be honest about the anger, because the rules of this kind of fight are mostly about what you do with it. I felt it in my hands, mostly, a tightness across the knuckles when I read each new notice. I felt it the morning the wheel measure man rolled his little device across a Diane's view of the field. Anger is not a tool you can file, though, and a fine is not an argument you can win by shouting. I had spent 31 years watching people lose good cases because they got loud in front of the wrong official. So I filed. Every notice, every photograph, every dated note went into the folder, and the folder got a rubber band and then a second folder. In October, the harassment widened. I did a little surveying still, small jobs for old clients, a boundary stake here, a corner search there. Cash work mostly, nothing that needed a crew, just me and the transit in a half day in someone's back 40. Brenda found out. I do not know how. Maybe she saw my truck leave with the equipment rack loaded. Maybe someone on the board mentioned it. A longtime client named Walt Bishop called me one evening, though. Embarrassed, his voice gruff the way it gets when he is trying not to be angry on someone else's behalf. He told me a woman from the HOA had phoned him. She had warned him that I was operating an unlicensed business out of a residential lot in violation of the covenants, and that he might be liable for hiring me. Walt is 71 and has farmed the same ground his whole life and does not scare. He told me he had asked the woman whether she knew that my license number was on the state board's public roster, and whether she knew that surveying a man's own back 40 for cash had nothing to do with her covenants, and whether she had anything better to do than call up old men to slander a tradesman. She had hung up on him. He laughed telling me about it, but underneath the laugh was the thing I needed to hear. Other clients might not laugh. Some of them might just quietly stop calling, and I would never know why. I asked Walt if he would be willing to put what she said in writing someday, with the date and as close to her words as he could remember. He said he would put it in writing and notarize it and frame it on his wall if it would help. I wrote down the date, the time, and Walt's account, word for word as he gave it to me, and I filed his name and his offer in the folder. I did not call it an affidavit out loud, and I did not call Walt an ally to his face, because men like Walt do not need to be recruited. They only need to be asked once and told the truth. The recurring rhythm of those months was a Tuesday morning. Brenda liked Tuesdays. She would appear at the end of the drive, usually around 10, sometimes with the clipboard, once with a man from the board named Gary, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, and she would deliver the same line in slightly different words. "The parcel is functionally part of our common area, Mr. Mercer, whether your fence agrees or not." That was her phrase. Functionally part of our common area. She said it the first morning. She said it again in October with Gary standing behind her. And she would say it a third time later, on the worst day, in a way I will get to. I wrote it down each time, word for word, because a person's exact words are evidence. And a person who repeats herself in 3 settings is building a record she does not know she is building. By November, the fines on paper had reached a number that would have frightened a man without a folder. 11 notices. The daily accrual, if I had ever acknowledged it, would have totaled into the thousands. The HOA's attorney sent a letter on heavy stationery, threatening a lien on my property for unpaid assessments. A lien on 2 acres that had been platted clean in 1974, that carried my late wife's name in the chain of title. That I had surveyed myself. That I had promised her would stay clean. I read the lien threat at the kitchen table with Tess doing homework across from me, the lamp between us and the folder at my elbow. And I felt the tightness come into my hands again, that knuckle-deep heat I had learned to wait out. I set the letter down. I wrote the date on the corner of it, the way I write the date on everything. I slid it into the folder behind the others. Tess looked up from her homework. She has a way of reading my hands before she reads my face. She asked if we were going to be okay. I told her the truth, because she is too much like her mother to take anything less. I told her that the people who keep the records win the slow fights, and that we had the records, and that the only thing I had to be careful about was patience, and not handing the other side a reason to call me the unreasonable one. She asked why I did not just show them the plat and end it. I told her that a careless person who has shown the answer too early only learns to argue around it, but a careless person who is allowed to keep building her case will eventually build it so tall and so wrong that one true document knocks the whole thing flat in a single afternoon. She thought about that for a while. Then she wrote something in her notebook, and I did not ask what, and she went back to her homework. I did go to a board meeting once, in November, not to argue but to listen and to be on the record as present and reasonable. I sat in a folding chair in the clubhouse while Brenda ran through the agenda. And when the boundary item came up, she described me to the room as a holdout who refused inspection and was costing the association legal fees. I did not stand up and unfold the plat. I raised my hand, was acknowledged, and said only that I had offered twice to walk the line with anyone willing, that the offer still stood, and that I believed the dispute would resolve itself the moment someone located the original survey pins. Then I sat down. A few neighbors looked at me differently after that. One of them, a younger man named Cole, who had bought the lot 2 down from mine, caught me in the parking lot afterward and said he had gotten the same kind of notice, that his fence was suddenly 3 feet wrong too, and that he could not afford a lawyer. I told him to start a folder. I told him to photograph his pins if he could find them. I gave him my number. The case was getting wider, and the wider it got, the more Brenda's mistake repeated itself in writing. That was the first turn. The moment I understood this was not about me. It was about a line drawn wrong along 6 lots, and a development that needed those 3 feet, and a woman who had decided that being president meant being right. I want to pause here for just a moment and say something to you directly, because you have stayed with me this far. If you have ever gotten a notice like this, the instinct is to either pay it to make it go away or to explode. Do neither. Start the folder. Then come back to the story. December was quiet, the kind of quiet that means someone is preparing. Then in January, the line was crossed, and it was crossed in a way I had not let myself expect. It was a Thursday, and I was out on a job, staking a corner for an old client across the county an hour away. Tess was home from school early. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone rang, and it was Tess, and her voice was wrong, fast and thin and breaking in the middle of words. "Dad, there are men," she said. "There are men with a machine, and they are cutting the fence." I told her to stay inside and lock the door and not to go out. And I told her to call the sheriff, and I told her I was coming. And the whole hour home, I drove with both hands tight on the wheel and my heart going like a hammer. Here is what had happened, pieced together from Tess's photographs and the deputy's report and what I saw when I got there. Brenda had hired a contractor crew to remove what she called the encroaching fence. They had come with a skid steer and a pair of bolt cutters and a printed work order. And they had started at the southwest corner, the corner with the brass-capped iron pin from 1974. And they had cut 3 sections of my split rail and pulled the posts and were working their way north along the line. Tess had photographed all of it from the upstairs window, the machine, the men, the cut rail, and Brenda standing at the end of the drive in a magenta blazer, directing them with her clipboard. And Tess, 16 years old and her mother's daughter, had done one more thing. When the skid steer operator started digging near the brass-capped pin, she had gone out onto the porch, not into the yard, just the porch, and called out that the iron pin was a survey monument, and it was a crime to disturb it. The operator had stopped. He did not know what a survey monument was, but he knew the word crime. And he shut the machine down and would not start it again until someone in authority told him the pin was clear. That pause saved the pin. That pause may have saved the case. When I got home, there was a sheriff's truck in the drive, and a young deputy named Reyes standing between Brenda and my porch. Brenda was mid-sentence, telling him the parcel was functionally part of the common area and that she had every right to remove an illegal structure. 3 times now. First introduction, the board meeting, and now, on the worst day, with my fence in pieces behind her, Reyes had his hands up, palms out, the posture of a man trying to keep 2 parties apart. And he was saying that without documentation, he could not let anyone remove anything, and that this looked like a civil matter that had gotten ahead of itself. I did not shout. I want you to know that because it was the hardest thing I have ever not done. My fence was cut. My daughter had been frightened in her own home. The maple over Diane was 40 feet from a running skid steer. And I walked up calm, introduced myself to Deputy Reyes, and asked if I could show him something. He said yes. I went inside, and I came back out with the folder. This is the part where stillness matters more than noise. So I will slow down and tell it plainly. I laid the folder on the hood of the deputy's truck. I opened it to the certified copy of the recorded plat. The 1974 plat, stamped by the county recorder. And I set my finger on the line that showed my lot extending 3 feet past my fence to the platted edge of the easement. I told Reyes that the southwest corner was marked by an iron pin with a brass cap that had been in the ground since 1974, and that it was a legal survey monument, and that disturbing it was a violation of state law. I showed him the photographs, dated, of the pin in place across 30 years. I showed him the 2019 HOA map and pointed out, without raising my voice, that whoever drew it had snapped the line to the gravel instead of the platted easement, which put it 3 feet off all along the eastern tier. I told him I was a licensed surveyor, that my number was on file with the state, and that I would stake the true corner for him right then if he wanted to see it. Reyes looked at the plat. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the cut fence and the skid steer and the brass-capped pin still sitting undisturbed in the dirt where Tess's warning had stopped the digging. Then he turned around, and he looked at Brenda, and the whole weather of the scene changed. He asked her for her documentation. She held up the work order from the contractor. He asked her for the survey that located the line. She said the 2019 map was the survey. He asked her quietly whether the firm that drew the 2019 map had located the iron pins. She did not answer because she did not know, because no one had ever checked. There was a long beat where nobody said anything. A jay called somewhere back by the maples. Reyes folded the work order closed and handed it back to her and said that the iron pin was a recorded monument, that destroying a survey marker and removing a fence on a contested line was not something a homeowners association got to do on its own authority, and that he was documenting the cut fence as property damage. He told the contractor crew to load up and leave. They left. Brenda stood at the end of my drive in her magenta blazer, holding a work order that had just become worthless, and for the first time in 2 years, she had nothing to say. I will give you the paired numbers now, because they are the spine of how this ended. On my side of the ledger, by the time the deputy stood at my truck, I had paid $0 in fines. 0, not one of the 11 notices had been honored, because not one of them was owed. And the recorded plat that proved it had been sitting in a folder in my filing cabinet the entire time, stamped and certified in 1974, 11 years before Brenda Coyle ever joined the association. On her side of the ledger, the association had assessed me 11 notices, threatened 1 lien, hired 1 fake inspector and 1 contractor crew, and the contractor's invoice for cutting my fence came to $1,900, which the association had paid up front. $1,900 to destroy a fence that the plat proved was legal. 0 against $1,900. That was the gap, and once the deputy saw it, everyone saw it. It did not end in my driveway, though. It ended where it should have, in a public room, in front of a neutral authority. And that is the part I want to walk you through. Because the driveway was only the moment the truth stopped being deniable. The county scheduled a hearing. The cut fence had become a sheriff's report. And the sheriff's report had reached the county surveyor's office. And the county surveyor, a woman named Pat Lindqvist, whom I had worked alongside for 15 years, pulled the original plat from the county's own records to compare it against the 2019 HOA map. She did not need me to tell her what she would find. She found the same 3-foot error I had found, snapped to the gravel along the entire eastern tier. She brought the microfilm plat and a record of survey she ran herself, locating the same brass-capped iron pin that had stopped the skid steer, and she scheduled a public boundary determination at the county building. The room was small and bright. Fluorescent light and folding chairs, the county seal on the wall behind a long table where Pat sat with 2 assistants. Brenda came with the HOA's attorney and with Doug, her husband, who I now understood was Hollow Ridge Partners, who needed the corridor, who had looked at my fence line a beat too long 2 springs before. Cole was there. Walt Bishop was there with his notarized statement. Tess sat beside me with her notebook. The folder sat on the table in front of me, and beside it, unfolded for the first time in public, the certified 1974 plat. Pat ran the hearing the way a good surveyor runs everything, slowly and by the record. She laid the original recorded plat on the table. She laid the 2019 HOA map beside it. She laid her own record of survey beside both. She put her finger on the brass-capped iron pin as it appeared on all 3, the original monument from 1974. And she showed how the recorded plat and her field survey agreed to within 1/10 of a foot, and how the 2019 map disagreed by 3 feet because it had been scaled off an aerial photograph and snapped to the edge of the gravel. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. The line on the recorded plat was where my fence had stood for 30 years. The HOA had been measuring from the wrong place for 2 years, fining 6 homeowners for a line that the county's own records placed 3 feet the other way. Brenda's attorney tried once. He said the association had relied in good faith on a professional map. Pat answered that a map scaled off an aerial without locating the monuments was not a boundary survey, and never had been, and that the recorded plat controlled, as it had controlled since 1974. Then she asked the question that ended it. She asked the attorney whether the association had ever, in 2 years of notices and fines, and 1 contractor crew with bolt cutters, pulled the original recorded plat from the county for $40 and a walk down the hall. The attorney did not answer. Brenda did not answer. The record answered for them. Pat made her determination on the spot. The recorded 1974 plat controlled. My fence was legal. The eastern tier line was 3 feet off in the HOA's 2019 map, and every fine issued against that line was void. She ordered the association to vacate all 11 notices against me and the matching notices against Cole and the 4 other homeowners on the tier. And she referred the cut fence incident to the county for the property damage matter the deputy had already documented. Here is the proportionate part, the part where a thing falls exactly where it was aimed. Hollow Ridge Partners had filed for a grading permit for the access corridor, and that permit depended on the eastern easement being 3 feet wider than the recorded plat allowed. The same boundary determination that vacated my fines also fixed the easement at its true platted width, which was 3 feet too narrow for a cement truck to turn. The corridor did not fit. The permit was denied. Doug Coyle's project lost the cheap path it had been clearing 1 fine at a time, and it lost it because of the exact same recorded plat his wife had spent 2 years refusing to read. The 3 feet she tried to take were the 3 feet that sank the corridor. Brenda resigned the presidency before the next meeting. Not because anyone forced her out, but because a president who finds 6 neighbors over a line the county throws out in 20 minutes does not keep the room. I want to bring you back to the Maple, because that is where this settles for me. The evening after the hearing, Tess and I drove home, and the light was coming across the field the way Diane had loved, low and gold along the grass. The cut sections of fence still lay where the crew had dropped them. The brass-capped iron pin sat in the dirt at the southwest corner, undisturbed, exactly where the original surveyor had driven it in 1974. Exactly where Tess's voice from the porch had stopped a machine from tearing it out. Tess stood by the pin with her notebook closed for once and said, "That little piece of metal won, didn't it?" I told her it did, but that it only won because somebody wrote it down in 1974 and somebody else kept the record and a third somebody refused to let it be erased. She thought about that. Then she went and got the post hole digger, and we set the first new fence post before dark, on the line, on the plat, where it had always been. So here is the lesson, plainly, because you stayed for it. Your property line is not where a clipboard says it is, and not where a pretty map snapped it. It is where the recorded plat and the survey monuments put it. And those records are public, and they are cheap, and almost nobody pulls them. Go to your county recorder and get a certified copy of the plat for your lot. Find your iron pins and photograph them with a date. Keep a folder and write down every notice and every conversation with the date and the time. When someone in a blazer tells you that your land is functionally part of their jurisdiction, you do not have to argue. You only have to keep the record and wait for the moment it can be read out loud by someone whose job it is to read it. If you have a story like this, a fence, a fine, a line someone tried to move, tell me about it below. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. because next week I am going to tell you about the man whose HOA tried to claim his well, and what happened when the water rights turned out to be older than the subdivision. Take care of your corners. I will see you then.